r/ask Reddit. What stories about World War II did your grandparents tell you, and/or what did you find out about their lives during that period? My grandpa very rarely talked about it, but he was in the Pacific in World War II. He caught malaria and was sent to a hospital ship to recover, and the Japanese sunk the ship. So he floated for like 10 hours clinging to the wreckage with active malaria before finally being rescued. And after all that, he re-enlisted and fought in the Korean War also. What a badass. My grandmother was a Jew in a Nazi concentration camp. She was pretty much certain to die because she didn't have a job and she wasn't cunning enough to survive on her own. It was rough. One day some local farmers in Russia bought her to work for them during the day. So she would go to the farm to work during the day and come back at night. The farmers would feed her and clothe her. They also helped her sneak food into the camp. Often, I don't know how, she would sneak soups into the camp to give to her friends and family. The farmers were endless in their kindness and helped her survive until the Nazis were defeated and everyone was released. My grandmother was reunited with her family and lived a long life until she died last year. Without the farmers' kindness, I don't think I would be here today. Grandpa and grandma were out in Austria. Grandma was super pregnant with my aunt. They were stumbling through the forest when they met 5 Afro-American soldiers. Might have been the first time they've seen black people. One asked Grandpappy to come closer. No common language, just by using hand signs. They both thought that that's the end. They're done. It's scary to run into guys with big guns in the forest. Turns out, they got a bunch of eggs in exchange for some help at a nearby farm. And when they saw grandma's big belly, they thought she'll be needing the extra calories more than them. So they put it all into Pa's hat and pointed on grandma, smiling. Best dudes ever. My grandmother was born in 1938, so she was young, 7 years old, when the war ended. She told me she remembers being scared to death when there were blackout drills, even if the Germans were going to bomb the US. Her small town in North Carolina would have never been a target, but I can see that a young child wouldn't really understand that, and she remembers her mother telling them that the war was over. She said she was excited because that meant they could get tires for their bicycle. They had a bike, but no tires for it since so much rubber was being used for the war effort. My grandma was a child during the war and lived in a pretty small town in the UK. She always used to tell me about the time she got meningitis, must have been viral rather than bacterial, and got rushed to the hospital. Since this was a war, the hospital was also being used to treat soldiers, so there were a load of Americans there at the time. Anyway, she used to tell them she was saving up money and they used to give her some. They had a soft spot for her. Some of them probably missed their own kids, I guess. Her mum used to find it so embarrassing that she was being given money and used to try and make the soldiers take it back, but they never would. Not quite as dramatic as other people's battle stories, but I always found it pretty cute. She also used to ask her dad to bring back a German man's head when he'd go back to war, so make of that what you will. My great-grandfather would never talk about his time in World War II except for funny stories that were kid-friendly stuff about the company getting drunk. When we were a little older, my cousin, who lived closer and knew him better, got him to record some of his more real stories before he passed, so that he could share without having to show his emotions in person. One story in particular he told will forever stick with me. They were walking through a bombed out area and saw a woman holding her dead baby. She told them thank you. He replied, what are you thanking us for? We killed your baby. He feared hell at the end of his life for the things he had seen and done. The pain in his voice. War is fucked. My grandfather was a navigator on the B-17 Flying Fortress. I'm uncertain of the exact date, but later in the war his plane was shot down and he was knocked unconscious by a piece of flying shrapnel. One of his crewmen actually pushed his seemingly lifeless body out of the plane as it descended and pulled his parachute cord, saving his life. Unfortunately, they were over Germany at the time and he landed well behind enemy lines. He spent the next 18 months in an Nazi POW camp before the Allies eventually won the war and liberated the camp. He will be 100 years old next year, and to this day this is about the extent of the details that I've ever been able to learn about his experience. I imagine it was just been too traumatic of an experience for him to elaborate further, and I absolutely respect that. My grandfather was in the Navy and really didn't see much action. His brother was in the Army and saw plenty of action on Omaha Beach on D-Day as a medic. I learned this a little after Saving Private Ryan came out. He said that the beginning of the war was pretty accurate. He saw a lot of men die that day. He also told us stories of how, when men were dying, most would call out for their mothers, but would cry out for stranger things like food. He listened some guy screaming for a Coca-Cola for 5 minutes before that guy died. In the end, I feel honored that I got to hear about stuff that he saw because he was really there. My grandpa was captured by the Germans during the Battle of the Bulge and held in a prisoner of war camp until near the end of the war. Since he wasn't a smoker, he collected and used cigarettes inside the camp to barter and trade for food and other supplies. When the Allies were getting closer and the war was nearing its end, he used the cigarettes he had left to bribe one of the guards to let him and a few of his buddies go. By this time, they were nearly starved to death and weighed around 100 pounds, but they walked through the German countryside all the way back to the Allied lines. On the way, they stopped by an abandoned farmhouse where my grandpa, being the only one of the group raised on a farm, caught and cooked up a chicken for their meal. He took a small pewter cream pourer for coffee as a souvenir from that farmhouse, which I still have today in my apartment. My grandpa says, when the Germans came to our village he was fairly young. One day, he tried to steal some food from a shed because the people were starving, and a German soldier saw him and hunted him down. He was with a friend at that time and they tried to run into the forest, but his friend stepped on a landmine and died. My grandpa was fine, but laid down as well too, that the soldiers would think he's dead too. One of the soldiers came to check on them and saw that he was alive and the other one told him to kill him. Then he said, he's just a kid, and left him there. He still says, if it wasn't for that brave man he wouldn't be alive today. Even if he was a German soldier, he was good at heart. In high school my history teacher told us a story about his grandparents and their time during the siege of Leningrad. He said that his grandparents scraped the glue off the back of the wallpaper and made it into a oatmeal type of food. The story that sticks with me is the one about the fresh meat. His grandpa came home one day and his wife had 2 fresh fillets. This was obviously suspicious, so he asked where she got this. She said a man knocked on the door selling meats, so she traded her engagement ring for it. He took a bite of the meat to confirm his suspicions, and when he tasted that it was sweet he knew. Apparently human meat is sweet and there were rumors of some people who were slicing the buttock off corpses and selling the meat to unsuspecting customers. He tracked the guy down and got the ring back. My grandfather only told us about the funny stuff. He was an officer on the US Minneapolis who was at sea with the carriers during Pearl Harbor. I remember him telling us about a cartoonist who had a frequent gag of people peeing off the ship or off seaplanes. Another one was about a gunner who was compared shooting down planes to duck hunts. It was later, when I looked up the ship, that I saw why. They took a torpedo in the Battle of Tassafaranga that crumpled the bow of the ship. Grandpa was a bridge officer who worked with the section that got hit, and he lost some of his close friends. He only told my dad on one occasion, when he was young. My grandfather was an interpreter in the army. He was stationed in New York for a spell before being shipped out to serve in the European theater. 2 stories. He was fluent in German. In 1945 he was sent to the death camps in Poland for the recovery effort. He and my uncle Al served in different companies. Both had been to the camps and took a bunch of personal pictures of the survivors, the bodies. After the war, the pictures sat in a shoebox in their attics until a few years later when their wives threw them out. The other story happened after the war. My grandpa settled down in Cleveland, and when his daughter, my aunt, was in elementary school, her teacher, who was German American, told the kids that the Holocaust was fake and American propaganda. She ends up telling my grandpa about it, and he put her in the car, drive her to the school, and absolutely rained hell down upon that teacher. My family to this day says that was the angriest they've ever seen him. My great-grandfather was in the Navy, and one night they docked in Ireland overnight. They were fed and served copious amounts of liquor by the locals. My great-grandpa got so drunk that he fell and smashed his face on some stairs, resulting in a trip to the hospital. He missed the sailing the next day and was unable to board the ship. That ship went out and 2 days later was sunk by a German U-boat and everyone died.